all sorts of agencies and departments. It's going to be one of his major issues, and he doesn't want it just to be limited. They'll also be talking about it with energy as well. So there's just so much that he is going to be doing there. And remember, this is something that part of the whole Democratic Party wants, but particularly progressives. They want this to be sort of the number one issue that he's going to look at, and he's trying to deliver on that. And he's going to have to do more than President Obama did. They want him to go back to what President Obama did, undo some of these things from President Trump, and take it a step further.
I'm Jen White. You're listening to 1A. We're rounding up the week's news with White House correspondent Anita Kumar of Politico and Jeff Mason of Reuters. We have one more historic piece we should definitely talk about. Biden has nominated Representative Deb Haaland as the Interior Secretary. Jeff, talk a bit about why this is such a big deal.
Well, it's a big deal because she's the first Native American person to be a cabinet member, and in particular to be leading Interior, which with all of the U.S.'s history of dealing with Native Americans is just really of consequence. And she was rumored to be sort of the front runner for that job. It does take another Democratic voice out of the slimmer majority that the House has of Democrats, but it is absolutely historic, both because of her just membership in the cabinet, but also the department that she will lead.
Anita, what are you expecting from these confirmation hearings?
Well, just like everything lately, I feel like, some of these are going to be tough, because things are so partisan. It's interesting that he's rolling these out, and I mean, of course, expected this is the time that he would do it, but it's a tough thing because he does not know if the Senate will be Republican or Democrat. I mean, there's some thought that it's still going to be Republican run. It's likely to be, but he doesn't know that. So he's, President-elect Biden really has to look at that, think about that, and that's thinking about, if it's Republican run and he needs to get these people through there, then perhaps they can't be as progressive as some Democrats would like. The one that I'm still hearing a lot about is Neera Tanden, who he nominated to run the Office of Management and Budget. That Republicans are saying it's just a non-starter, that she's not going to be able to get through because she has been so partisan. She worked on the Affordable Care Act. She's very close to Hillary Clinton, and they feel like there's a lot in her background that is going to be tough to get through. So, I expect most of them will get through, but you are going to see some pushback from Republicans on some.
Well, we've been talking about incoming names, but we also had news this week of a departure. Attorney General Bill Barr resigned. President Trump tweeted, quote, "Just had a very nice meeting with Attorney General Bill Barr at the White House. Our relationship has been a very good one. He has done an outstanding job. As per letter, he will be leaving just before Christmas to spend the holidays with his family," end quote. Jeff, why is Barr going now?
Let's just underscore the fact that it is unusual for a attorney general or anyone in the cabinet, for that matter, to be leaving with only roughly a month left in the administration. And the answer to your question, Jen, is that not everything President Trump said in that tweet is true. Their relationship has not always been great. Barr has been a strong proponent of the president since taking over as Attorney General, but they parted ways or disagreed on some key things. Most recently, the Attorney General said that they had not found evidence of widespread fraud in the election. That, of course, contradicts the key argument that President Trump has been making for trying to overturn the election results. So that's no doubt one of the reasons, but they did part more or less on good terms, and the president sent out that tweet that day after they had a meeting that was described as amicable in the Oval Office.
Well, Anita, stepping in is Jeffrey Rosen, who's set to act as Attorney General for President Trump's last month in office. But there already seems to be tension. Trump reportedly has asked Rosen to set up a special counsel to investigate the president-elect's son, Hunter Biden. What's going on here?
This is going to be tough because even though it's just a month or so left, there are going to be things that President Trump wants him to push through. Rosen is a deputy attorney general who didn't get a lot of attention, I would say, just because Bill Barr, had so much of the attention. He has vowed, he had vowed before, I should say, in the past, not to let politics interfere with his job, but there are people that say, well, he did let politics interfere, that he got involved in some of the cases of President Trump's, associates and friends, criminal cases. So, there are people that are skeptical of him. Clearly, the president thinks that he has some power and can push some things through. So we'll have to see what happens. Again, there's only a month left, so there's only a certain amount of things you can do in that time.
That's Anita Kumar. She's Politico's White House correspondent. Also with us, Jeff Mason, Reuters White House correspondent. Jeff, Anita, thanks to you both. 1A's lead audio engineer and sound designer is Jake Cherry. He gets technical assistance from Ben Privet, Mike Kidd, and Rashad Young. Aileen Humphreys is the producer and editor of 1A On Demand. Gabrielle Healy is our digital editor, and Chris Castano is our digital producer. This program comes to you from WAMU, part of American University in Washington, distributed by NPR. I'm Jen White. Thanks for listening. Have a great weekend, and let's talk more soon. This is 1A. Support for NPR comes from this station and from Twilio, a customer engagement platform used by millions of developers to reinvent how businesses communicate with their users. Learn more at Twilio.com. From Capital One. Capital One's banking app lets people manage their money anytime, anywhere. Capital One. This is banking reimagined. What's in your wallet? Capital One NA. And from the William T. Grant Foundation at wtgrantfoundation.org. Who stands to benefit most from a new round of stimulus checks?
Working families and working people should be first to get relief, not last.
For some, this new aid package is a desperately needed lifeline, but for others, it's a winter windfall. I'm Jen White. The latest on what to expect this time around and when we can expect it. Next time on 1A.
Support for WNYC comes from Dancing Deer Baking Company, delivering natural scratch-baked cookies and fudge brownies to family and friends for over 22 years. Dancing Deer Baking Company. No matter the distance, we got you covered. More at dancingdeer.com.
It's WNYC. The takeaways next on 93.9 FM. If you're listening on AM 820, it's the BBC News Hour. We're going to see mostly clear skies tonight. It's going to be pretty cold. Low of about 20 this evening. Wind chills between 10 and 15. Tomorrow, Saturday, sunny through the day, high near 33, wind chills between 15 and 25. Should be partly cloudy for tomorrow night, low of about 30. And then by Sunday, mostly cloudy. It's going to be pretty warm by comparison with a high on Friday afternoon of about 40 degrees. You're listening to WNYC on a Friday. It's 3 p.m.
This is WNYC, FM, HD, and AM New York. Welcome to News Hour from the BBC World Service. I'm Julian Marshall. The WHO says it's ready to roll out hundreds of millions of COVID vaccine doses to 4 countries early next year. We'll have reaction from Africa.
There are some sign of despair and
Get the perennial political football of the DACA program.
It's been a litigation roller coaster for those who hold DACA.
We meet Congressman-elect Cliff Betts, the sole Republican in Oregon's congressional delegation, plus a check-in on Georgia and how the political and religious battle lines have materialized in that high-stakes contest for the U.S. Senate.
Ebenezer balanced personal piety, moral reform with social justice messages, holding the city, the state, the nation accountable.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway, right after these headlines. Live from NPR News, I'm Lakshmi Singh. The Food and Drug Administration is expected to authorize emergency use of Moderna's COVID-19 vaccine in this country in the next day or so. NPR's Joe Palca says an advisory panel is recommending the FDA move forward with Moderna's vaccine days after the rollout of Pfizer's vaccine began for frontline healthcare workers.
Emergency use authorization would allow people to begin getting the new vaccine within days. The vaccine is made by the biotech company Moderna. On Thursday, an advisory panel unanimously concluded, with one abstention, that based on the totality of scientific evidence available, the benefits of the vaccine outweighed the risks for people 18 and older. The panel was convinced by data from a large study of the vaccine conducted in 30,000 volunteers. It showed that people were protected from COVID-19 illness more than 94% of the time, and there were no clear signals indicating the vaccine might not be safe. Joe Palca, NPR News.
Hoping to convince skeptical Americans to get their shots, Vice President Mike Pence was vaccinated against COVID-19 today in front of the cameras. The White House held an event where Pence's wife Karen, as well as Surgeon General Jerome Adams, also received the COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer and BioNTech.
We gather here today at the end of a historic week to affirm to the American people that hope is on the way.
President-elect Biden gets his shot Monday. Vice President-elect Kamala Harris about a week later. They also plan to be vaccinated in public. The Supreme Court dodged making any major ruling on President Trump's plan to exclude unauthorized immigrants for the 2020 census. But the decision, in all likelihood, leaves opponents of the plan the ability to block Trump's action anyway. NPR's Nina Totenberg explains.
The court said that at the end of the day, it would be premature for us to rule on the merits of this case, because at present, the case is riddled with contingencies and speculation that impede any final review by this court. The justices acknowledged that Trump, through an order issued last July, is trying to exclude undocumented immigrants from the census count, but the court said at the moment any prediction of how many is nothing more than a moving target. And the justices said, we simply do not know what the president is going to do. The court split 6-3 along ideological lines, with the liberal justices in dissent. They said Trump's actions were clearly illegal under federal law. Nina Totenberg, NPR News, Washington.
More than 1 million ballots have been cast in early voting for 2 Senate runoff elections in Georgia. The race determines whether the U.S. Senate remains in the control of the Republicans or flips to Democrats. At last check on Wall Street, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was down 226 points at 30,077. That's down roughly 0.75% since the open. This is NPR News.
And this is WNYC in New York. I'm Sean Carlson. Governor Andrew Cuomo is backing away from statements earlier in the week suggesting New York City might have to go into full-blown shutdown. At his press conference today, Cuomo said the region could avert a shutdown if people are careful.
Celebrate smart, healthy holidays, hospital management. We don't shut down. I bet on New York. I bet on New Yorkers.
If hospitals indicate to the state that they're 3 weeks away from reaching 85% maximum capacity, that triggers a region to go into a pause order. Statewide, more than 6,000 people are hospitalized with COVID-19. At the height of the pandemic in the spring, there were 3 times that number of people hospitalized. The NYPD officer who shot and killed an unarmed man in a 2016 road rage incident has yet to face disciplinary action 2 months after New York City Civilian Complaint Review Board substantiated charges against him. On today's Brian Lehrer show, Mayor de Blasio said he didn't know when Officer Wayne Isaac's disciplinary trial would take place.
I need to know what the CCRB is saying and planning on doing. I just don't happen to know that. The case went through a PD process, a police department process. The CCRB has taken it up more recently.
Isaacs shot and killed Delron Small during an off-duty traffic dispute on Atlantic Avenue in Brooklyn. He faced prosecution but was acquitted of all charges in 2017 and stayed on the force. Tonight, it'll be mostly clear. It's going to be pretty cold again. We'll have about 20 degrees outside tonight. Wind chills between 10 and 15. It'll be sunny tomorrow, Saturday, high near 33 in the afternoon. Wind chills between 15 and 25. It'll be partly cloudy tomorrow night. We'll see a low of just about 30. It's WNYC at 3:06.
Support for NPR comes from TIAA, who believes their clients' passion will never run out, nor will TIAA's commitment to not only get clients to retirement, but through it. TIAA.org/neverrunout.
Next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour, control of the Senate hangs on the Georgia runoff election. And yet Republicans in the state are at each other's throats.
You have a Republican election officials who are getting these threats from Republicans who think that somehow, in some warped universe, these Republicans, Trump supporters, have thrown the election to Biden.
The battle over Georgia. Next time on the New Yorker Radio Hour. tomorrow morning at 10 on 93.9 FM, WNYC.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway. Good to be with you. Immigration was an issue we heard a lot about in the 2016 election from candidate Donald Trump.
When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists. They are not our friend, believe me.
No path to legalization unless they leave the country and come back.
And you can call it deported if you want. The press doesn't like that term. You can call it whatever the hell you want. They're gone. We are going to build a great border wall.
And when he was elected, one of President Trump's first actions was a travel ban on Muslim countries.
We're going to take our case as far as it needs to go, including all the way up to the Supreme Court. And let me tell you something, I think we ought to go back to the first one and go all the way, which is what I wanted to do in the first one.
And during the 2018 midterms, the narrative changed, but the sentiment did not.
This is an invasion. When you see these caravans starting out with 20,000 people, that's an invasion. I was badly criticized for using the word invasion. It's an invasion.
And perhaps the most consequential, Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy was widely discussed by many.
Not taking children! The families out of prison! These warehouses are very large cages in which children have been separated from the parents.
Bringing children with you doesn't guarantee you won't get prosecuted.
Nobody likes this policy. You saw the president on camera that he wants this to end, but everybody has Congress has to act.
End it on his own.
We all should be able to agree that in the United States of America, we will not intentionally separate children from their parents. We will not do that. We are better than that.
And even early on in the 2020 Democratic primary campaign, it was a major factor.
Democrats have to get off the back foot. We have to lead on this issue because we know it is right.
Down at the border, we've got to rework this entirely.
We should also this all off. Get rid of Trump's zero-tolerance policy, the Remain in Mexico policy, and the metering policy.
Now, did you make a mistake with those implications? The president did the best thing that was able to be done. How about you? I'm the vice president of the United States.
But the issue of immigration was rarely mentioned in the 2020 general election campaign in the fall. I wondered if the lack of policy debate about immigration was deliberate, or if the issue was sidelined, like most things, by the pandemic and its economic fallout. And I wanted to understand what that may mean for the future of immigration policies put in place by the Trump administration. So I called
Dara Lind, and I'm a reporter with ProPublica covering immigration,
to find out what she thinks.
Really, this was a very strange campaign because the pandemic and the economic crisis that it engendered took up so much space that you just didn't see a more conventional policy debate on what are the candidates' stances on various issues. I don't know that immigration was uniquely sidelined. I think it just is the most obvious example of how the 2020 election kind of prevented any sort of normal campaign policy rollouts because Trump had been able to set it as a big culture war issue in 2016, 2018.
As President-elect Biden is rolling out what he calls his top priorities, his top 4 priorities are coronavirus, economic recovery, racial equality, and climate change. And there were a number of Democrats and progressive groups who were not happy that immigration wasn't listed in there. What do you think that is about? And what do you see as sort of the Biden path forward on this issue?
So when we talk about what a president's priorities are, I think that there are particular parts of the job where that matters more than others. First of all, there is a question about what would the legislative priorities be that the Biden administration would be pushing on Congress, which obviously will matter a lot more if Democrats take the Senate. And in that regard, there is a lot of very limited oxygen. I mean, I'm thinking back to the first 2 years of the Obama administration when there was a lot of Democratic infighting about what the legislative priority would be after healthcare, and immigration very much lost out in that fight. If you believe that the current immigration kind of policy setup is broadly broken and needs a big legislative fix, including, legalizing the 11 million or so unauthorized immigrants in the country, then yes, not being listed as a priority is a big problem in that regard. But because the executive branch is large and diverse, and there are a lot of different people working on different issues, it doesn't necessarily slow the ability of immigration, regulations and that kind of thing, executive actions, to not be a priority. It's a question of political capital. And that, I think, is where there's still a little bit of progressive worry that the Biden administration is going to be less aggressive than some progressives want, not because they're focusing on other things, but because they don't necessarily want to bring attention to immigration as an issue.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because the person that Biden has tapped to lead the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, comes from the Obama era. There was a lot of criticism of the Obama administration's hesitancy on kind of, moving in a more progressive way. So does his DHS pick suggest that indeed this will look more like an Obama era policy on immigration than one that we heard about a lot during the 2020 Democratic primaries, which was much more progressive?
Mayorkas is, I wouldn't say a unity pick necessarily, but I was honestly surprised at how warm the reception to him was among groups that were criticizing the Obama administration. It does seem that he personally had a reputation for being on the more progressive side of that administration. And to be fully honest, I think it doesn't hurt that that's a job that not a whole lot of people want. It's not a job that pays a lot of political dividends, and having someone who's very experienced in the department who wants the job is, that's a plus. The big success of the Obama administration at DHS was its 2014 executive actions, which a couple of those got blocked in court, but they did successfully rein in ICE's ability to just, arrest and deport unauthorized immigrants without paying any attention to kind of the equities involved and getting them to exercise significant prosecutorial discretion. And that happened in large part because the then DHS Secretary Jay Johnson did a lot of internal stakeholder work and built up a lot of legitimacy. So having someone who already kind of has those relationships is probably the way you're going to get change done. But I do think that as we see kind of some of the lower level staff names, that it's just very hard to name a bunch of people who weren't in the Obama administration and weren't in the Trump administration, not necessarily people who were political in the Trump administration, but senior civil servants who stayed in government and ended up having some decision-making power. And I do think that there are probably going to be fights. We saw it a little bit when Cecilia Munoz, who was kind of Obama's point person on immigration, got named to the transition team. There will be upcoming battles on who should get to make immigration policy decisions under Biden, and the tension between having people who know the system and having people who haven't been associated with policies that, as you said, the party has tried to turn its back on.
So let's think about, the realities of being the president, which is, one, you have this sort of proactive agenda, some of the things that President Biden can do on immigration, on things like DACA, et cetera, through executive authority or push legislatively. And then there's the things that happen that you have no control over, like, for example, crisis in Central America that continues to push people to seek refuge in the United States. So can we talk through the tension between both of those things? Like, how much of the Biden administration do you think is going to be just dealing in a reactionary mode to another border surge, given how much struggle is still happening in Central America and in Mexico?
That really is the million-dollar question. And again, it's not necessarily a matter of, if they have to be responding to events, they won't have the policy bandwidth to do other things. Like, there's nothing in the levers of government that says, if more than X people are coming to the U.S.-Mexico border in any given month, you have to take staffing away from fully reinstating the DACA program, which is a totally different population. But again, it is a question of saw in 2014 that the Obama administration's efforts to, to take broad executive action on immigration were delayed by several months when they had to deal with a surge of unaccompanied children coming to the U.S.-Mexico border, partly because it was something that they just needed to direct a lot of resources to very quickly, but partly because they didn't like the optics of being seen as dovish on immigration when the border was quote-unquote overwhelmed. And so there is nothing in Central America has made it any better for people to stay there than it was a year ago. We saw really, really low numbers of northward migration in the spring and summer. And for a bit, it looked like that was the new normal because countries were really shutting down their mobility policies due to the coronavirus, because people were worried about catching it if they moved through a bunch of different areas. But what it seems like in retrospect is that was more of a temporary pause, and that smugglers were deliberately pausing their operations and then restarted them in the fall. And so between that, the economic collapse that has made a lot of people totally out of work, and hurricanes that have struck Central America in recent weeks, there are so many reasons to leave. And even if Donald Trump were going to be still in office next year, it would seem that there would be a relative rise from these mind-bogglingly low levels of migration this year. And what we saw under the Trump administration is that relative rise is the point, right? The Trump administration was the victim of its own success at the border in some ways. They had really, really low levels of apprehensions in the first few months of the Trump term, as migrants appear to have kind of taken a wait-and-see approach before deciding whether to leave. And because they couldn't sustain those low levels, they often acted as if they were in crisis footing, even when, historically apprehensions weren't that high. So if that approach remains, then yeah, the Biden administration is going to be on a politically defensive footing very early on. It may or may not be the case that the number of people coming gets to the point where it actually does exceed capacity. And I think that also will depend on what border policies are, because the current policy at the border is that everybody just gets expelled back to Mexico or deported back to their home countries in a matter of really just hours, because of an order put up by the CDC early in the coronavirus pandemic. And if the Biden administration chooses to continue that policy, it'll be a little easier for them logistically to deal with more people. But even if from a capacity standpoint, you're not reaching overwhelmed numbers, the idea of a kind of media attention to a border crisis or media attention to rising numbers, coupled with the fact that immigration hawks are already saying that any rise in numbers will be because people are enthusiastic about a Biden amnesty, might make the kind of people who were making the decisions in 2014 a little bit worried about being seen as being too aggressively left or too aggressively dovish. Exactly. On the issue.
Dara Lind covers immigration policy for ProPublica. Coming up next, a look at DACA and the latest legal challenge the program faces. On Politics with Amy Walter.
I'm Goli Sheflaslami, President and CEO of New York Public Radio. As 2020 comes to a close and we look ahead toward the promise of a new year, I'm filled with gratitude for your friendship and support. All of our work is possible because of your generosity, and we hope we can count on you for a year-end charitable donation. Please visit wnyc.org/donate or call 888-376-WNYC. Thank you.
WNYC is supported by Geico Insurance, celebrating over 75 years of providing auto insurance for drivers across America. Geico can also help insure motorcycles, RVs, homes, and more. More at geico.com or 1-800-947-AUTO.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway. Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, began under the Obama administration in August of 2012. The first lawsuit challenging its legality was filed that same month. Now, DACA grants temporary legal status to undocumented immigrants who were brought to the United States as children.
Hi, my name is Syria Alvarez Valle. I am recipient living in Salt Lake City, Utah. My family immigrated to the U.S. in 2001 when I was about 5 years old. My family has called Utah home for the past 20 years. I grew up in the same city, went to elementary, middle school, high school, and college in Salt Lake. And so, yeah, Utah's been home, and it's been a good journey for my family, from the people that we've met who have been supportive in our lives despite our immigration status.
DACA recipients are awarded some security and stability, but it's not a long-term solution. There is a renewal process they must go through every couple of years.
I got DACA when I was a senior in high school. Right in the middle of my senior year was when my application was approved, and I've had DACA ever since, and it's been like 7 years now. And because of DACA, I was able to, one, have hope for the future. I think it allowed me to see more stability in my life than I had imagined before. And two, I was able to pay my way through college. I graduated from the University of Utah in 2017, and now I work full-time as a policy analyst at Voices for Utah Children.
The DACA program itself is actually quite popular. A recent Pew Research survey found that almost 3/4 of Americans favor granting permanent legal status to immigrants who came illegally to the U.S. when they were children. Even so, Congress has been deadlocked on the issue, and the DACA program continues to face legal challenges.
Hi, I'm Diane Solis. I'm a senior writer at the Dallas Morning News. I write often about immigration and social justice. It's been a litigation roller coaster for those who hold DACA. There's about 650,000 people who hold DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, and there's new litigation that began in 2018 when the state of Texas filed suit against the U.S. government. Trump was already in office. He'd already announced that he wanted to end DACA. So MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal and Defense Fund, jumped in and said they doubted that Trump would adequately defend DACA, so they were going to. And they got 22 DACA recipients together, and so now they're defending DACA. It's been on a slow track, but now, next week, there will be a hearing in Houston on this litigation. It's the only litigation that deals with whether DACA is lawful.
If the judge rules against DACA, what happens then? There are folks who try to bring it to a higher court and argue it. Does it go to the Supreme Court? What happens?
Absolutely. MALDEF has said they will immediately appeal. And we could have this back at the Supreme Court. But it's unlikely that it would end immediately. The MALDEF attorneys feel that it's unlikely that Hannon would immediately end it, and that there would be a phase out of the work permits. DACA provides a work permit, a 2-year work permit, and a deportation reprieve.
So is the only way then to ensure that the DACA program exists without the roller coaster like ride, as you pointed out, that it is entrenched into law, is that Congress has to pass some legislation? It cannot continue in this sort of executive order limbo.
That is what the immigration advocates and those that hold DACA want. They want permanent legislation that puts them on a pathway to U.S. citizenship. But as we know, Congress has been in gridlock for a long time over controversial issues. All that could change given after the outcome in Georgia, right, with the Senate. But could this limbo go on and on? Well, we do have another situation where there is a limbo that has gone on, and it's something that's known as TPS, Temporary Protected Status. And we've got Salvadorans who've been in temporary protected status for about 20 years.
So there's a history here, there's a precedent here for the U.S. immigration policy to basically go along in this year by year fashion rather than, or administration to administration fashion, rather than being actual settled law.
Definitely. There's definite history for that. And for those that hold these kind of limbo statuses, it's very hard for folks to plan their life in 1 year or 2 year increments. It's difficult to plan a career, to plan to get married, to have children, if you have the threat of a deportation hanging over you. It builds emotional stress.
Diane Solis, I really appreciate you taking the time to help walk us through this process. Thank you for all you do in covering it for the Dallas Morning News.
Well, thank you for having me.
Syriac Alvarez Valle, the DACA recipient we heard from at the top of our segment, she can breathe a sigh of relief for at least another 2 years. She learned this week that her application had been renewed. She told us what that means for her personally.
With my new DACA renewal, that means I have my DACA card for another 2 years, which is really great and can help me as I think through my future, as I plan going back to school. I am going to continue working this year and then applying to grad school programs this upcoming fall, and then hopefully next fall starting school, grad school program. And I think part of that hope does come also from the Biden administration, knowing that even though I may only have a 2-year DACA renewal, I do have hope that, one, there won't be as many challenges to the DACA program these next couple of years coming from the administration itself, and two, hoping for a permanent solution from Congress these next couple of 4 years.
There's more politics with Amy Walter coming up next. Stick with us.
Support for The Takeaway comes from Noom. Noom is here for people, providing information about how we can all stay well, physically, mentally, and emotionally, by offering support and guidance to navigate a healthy lifestyle with new challenges. More at Noom.com.
The worst coronavirus outbreaks in the U.S. have been behind bars.
Just because, you have a life sentence don't mean you sentence to death.
Now health officials are deciding whether inmates should be near the front of the line for a vaccine, a decision that puts science on a collision course with politics. I'm Ari Shapiro. That story this afternoon on All Things Considered from NPR News.
Today at 4 on WNYC.
WNYC supporters include the Oratorio Society of New York, presenting a reimagined virtual performance of Handel's Messiah. Kent Trundle, conductor. Stream starting Monday, December 21st at 8 p.m. Visit osny.org.
WNYC, independent journalism in the public interest. 93.9 FM and AM 820. NPR News and the New York Conversation.
It's Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway. Since November, we've been talking to the newly elected members of Congress, checking in with them before they're sworn in on January 3rd. This week, I sat down with
Cliff Bentz. I'm the congressman-elect from Oregon Congressional District 2.
Bentz is a Republican, and like his predecessor, Congressman Greg Walden, he'll be the only Republican serving in Oregon's delegation. I started out by asking him to describe his district.
Well, Oregon 2 is one of the largest congressional districts in the United States. There's much debate about exactly where it fits on the list, but I think it's number 7. It's just a fraction less than 70,000 square miles. Wonderful people in it, ranchers, farmers. We have a really, really wide variety of folks. We have the Columbia River on the north side. We have California on the south. We have Nevada, Idaho toward the east. It's very, very different when it comes to the people who live within it, which I like.
You know, you're coming into a Washington, D.C., where Republicans are in the minority, though by a smaller margin than many had expected. What did you learn about working with the majority party bipartisanship? What worked? What didn't work?
I would say that what I learned is you have to rely, if you're in the minority, a lot on the majority, on what they're going to allow you to do. I mean, it's kind of up to them. And I learned, in the last couple of years, I was in the Oregon State Senate, that the politics of Portland, Oregon had made it extraordinarily difficult for my Democrat friends in the Senate to even allow me as a Republican to be at the table. I was the co-chair of the Carbon Committee, a so-called Carbon Committee, and I was frozen out of the discussions for 5 months on a very, very serious cap and trade bill, one of the more aggressive approaches to managing carbon that I've seen. And I was just not allowed. I wasn't allowed in the room. And that was because my Democrat friends told me later, the folks that put them in office back in Portland didn't want a Republican in the room. And ultimately that meant that we Republican senators walked out to deny the Democrats a quorum and thus prevented the cap and trade bill from passing. But I will share with you, and I've told it to everybody, that that's not the right way to do business. The right way to do business is try to sit down and work these things out. But if you're not at the table, it's pretty tough to do.
I think a lot of people are hoping for the same thing, and it's clear that that's something that President-elect Biden is also counting on, and is something that he campaigned on. But he also campaigned on a pretty aggressive climate agenda, including zero net emissions by 2050. I'm wondering, as we think about the issues of climate going forward, the kinds of things you think you could support or work with Democrats or work with an administration getting actually accomplished.
There are many things in the climate space that work for large parts of my district that look suspiciously like adaptation. Irrigation, for example, is a means of adapting to a dry climate. And we irrigate an awful lot of CD2. And so if you use words like adaptation and sequestration and innovation, those words resonate with people on both sides of the aisle. And if you can show people that you can save them money by using electric cars, for example, rather than paying for fuel, they'll knock you down to get to an electric car. So you need to find those, and there are a lot of them as people get smarter about all these things and innovation happens, that you can find common ground. And you can move forward. On one side of the aisle, you'll be saying, hey, this is because it's saving you money. On the other side of the aisle, people will be saying, hey, it's reducing carbon. And those are the kind of opportunities that exist all over the place. What ends up happening is people get caught up in the politics of it. And that's too bad, because it makes it very, very difficult.
More of my conversation with Representative-elect Cliff Bentz in just a moment.
Support for The Takeaway comes from HIMSS, offering men access to licensed medical professionals online who can evaluate conditions including ED, hair loss, and more. If appropriate, prescription products can be purchased and shipped direct. More at forhims.com.
I've been talking with Representative-elect Cliff Bentz of Oregon about whether there's room for bipartisan action on climate change. The district Bentz will represent in Congress experienced horrific wildfires this year. I wondered if that was something that would bring Democrats and Republicans together on this issue.
One of the problems in talking about forests, most people, myself included, have a very difficult time understanding the sheer scale of the problem, because probably if you look at Northern California, Oregon, Washington, you have about 100 million acres of forest. And this year, 1 million of those acres in Oregon burned up. I think 3 million down in California. And that means we still have 96% of the forest to burn. And we don't want it to burn. But the sheer size of the problem is extremely hard for people to understand. The number that was thrown about and how we would try to address this issue just in Oregon was $44 billion. Well, we don't have $44 billion. And the other thing that generally is overlooked is how long this problem is going to take to fix. If we stopped generating carbon tomorrow, it would be 40 years before things perceptibly changed. And so what we have to do now is address the immediate problem. And then if people can say, well, it's drier because of climate change, let's assume it. If it's going to take 40 years to address the issue, and that assumes we stop generating carbon tomorrow, This is a long-term problem that needs immediate attention and long-term attention. And so two approaches. And the first one is to do a risk analysis to let people know what they're facing and how likely it is that their house is going to burn out. We lost 2,700 homes down in Medford, and we lost 600-700 homes just outside of Salem to fire. The one down in Medford was not so much forest involved. It was a different issue, but still, those kinds of risks are up and down the West Coast, and we need to let people know what they need to do to save themselves in the short run. In the long run, that's a great, big, huge issue, and it needs so much work. And it's not just one solution. It's going to be dozens of solutions to try to address this issue. It's huge. One thing I want to point out why you asked this question, a lot of people don't understand that the additional CO2 in the air is driving much more aggressive growth of the forest. 12, 13, 14% more growth than used to be the case. Just because there's so much more CO2 in the air that the trees are busy, sequestering. And so this makes the problem even more difficult to deal with.
You've been in politics for a little while now, and you're coming to Washington. How challenging is it to get political figures to think outside of just the immediate short term?
Well, it's hard. And social media has made it even more difficult. When you come at it from my standpoint, having spent so many years in this space, you realize that a short-term solution is really defrauding the people you're representing. That short-term gain is just not worth it. And somehow you've got to tell people, hey, this is a long-term play, and we're all going to have to work together over time, and eventually we'll get this problem solved. But boy, our whole society seems to be, they want immediate gratification. And this COVID situation is a great example. People being forced to actually wait.
How has COVID impacted you and your constituents? I mean, obviously we know the toll that it's taking nationally, but if you are talking to folks in your community, how are they processing this moment?
Well, it's a huge challenge. In fact, the local restaurants in my little town asked me yesterday if I would please come to a meeting with them Sunday at 2 p.m, up in a little coffee shop. We used to go there every morning, and we don't now because you don't get to go in. And this is true across the entire landscape of restaurants in Oregon, and they're going broke, and the people their lives are being destroyed. And it's not just that space; it's all kinds of spaces like that. And these people are desperate, and they're saying, "Hey, we know you're not in the state government anymore, but you know all of us. Would you please come down and give us some hope?"
Cliff Bentz is the Republican congressman-elect for Oregon's 2nd Congressional District.
I'm Kai Wright, and this week on the United States of Anxiety, we've got Georgia on our mind. Early voting has begun in a runoff election that will determine control of the U.S. Senate. But did you know that the reason Georgia created a runoff system in the first place was to limit the power of black voters? Journalist and voting rights expert Ari Berman explains that history and what's different now. That's this week on the United States of Anxiety, live Sunday at 6 on 93.9 FM and AM 820 WNYC.
This is Politics with Amy Walter on The Takeaway.
Since Georgia flipped blue for President-elect Biden, the gulf between the Old South and the New South has come into focus. Come January 5th, the state's closely watched runoff election will determine which party controls the U.S. Senate. In one race, Republican Senator David Perdue will face Democrat John Ossoff. In the other race, Republican Senator Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed to her seat last year by GOP Governor Brian Kemp, faces Democrat Reverend Raphael Warnock, the senior pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Kemp chose Loeffler to replace Republican Senator Johnny Isakson, who had stepped down for health reasons, in part because, theoretically, as a white woman from the Atlanta suburbs, she would have an appeal to white suburban voters turned off by President Trump. Meanwhile, instead of defaulting to a white moderate candidate, as they had in previous years, Democrats rallied around a black candidate, Reverend Warnock, early in the campaign. And here we are in the final weeks of a campaign that has, not surprisingly, turned ugly and expensive. More than $189 million has been spent in this race alone just on TV. Religion, specifically Warnock's sermons at Ebenezer Baptist, have become a flashpoint. Loeffler has run ads that take pieces of Warnock's sermons out of context in an attempt to paint him as a dangerous radical. But will attacks on a black church leader, intended to help motivate white conservatives, end up backfiring with the same suburban voters Loeffler was supposed to appeal to? And what does it tell us about the ways in which black and white Americans, specifically Georgians, see the role of religion in the political and social justice sphere? To better understand these dynamics, I called up Reverend Dr. Robert M. Franklin Jr.,
Professor in Moral Leadership at Emory University, Candler School of Theology,
and Jim Galloway,
the political columnist for the Atlanta Journal-Constitution newspaper.
We started by discussing the role that some Republicans hoped Loeffler would play.
She was intended as a kind of lure to these white college-educated voters in North Metro Atlanta who fled the party in 2018. The problem with that strategy is that U.S. Representative Doug Collins immediately jumped into the contest as well. It ended up being a 21-candidate field. The Republican side of the race was kind of concentrated between those two. Loeffler was forced to run far and hard to the right. She had ads out that compared herself favorably to Attila the Hun.
Yeah.
So that appeal to white suburban women just went out the window. Warnock had considered jumping into the 2014 race and passed on that. What it's done is really put a focus on the new alliance the Democrats are building between suburban Georgia and urban Georgia. They are giving up on the centrism approach that we've seen in decades past. The thing that really opened everybody's eyes in 2018 was that by following Abrams's formula, they got a larger share of white voters. I don't think you're going to see Democrats retreat for this.
Dr. Franklin, I wonder if you can, we can start by you telling us about the role that the Ebenezer Baptist Church plays in the state, both its politics, its influence, and also talk a little bit about its congregation.
So the Ebenezer Baptist Church is part of that late 19th century, early 20th century flourishing of African-American congregations in Atlanta, especially downtown and southwestern portion of Atlanta, where, by the way, the historic Atlanta University Center is located. So those extraordinary colleges, Morehouse College, Spelman College, Atlanta University, became kind of leadership incubators, producing ministers, physicians, lawyers, business people who helped to define Atlanta as a city with a strong and growing black middle class. Those folks wanted churches, and they were not comfortable in the traditional, smaller storefront folk churches that populate so many urban centers. They wanted, established congregations and even a few cathedrals. And Ebenezer began to emerge as one of those centers of hope that balanced personal piety, moral reform with social justice messages, holding the city, the state, the nation accountable, particularly on issues of racial and economic justice. And the early pastors, Pastor A.D. Williams, the forebears of Martin Luther King Jr., and it's certainly Dr. King's father, as we called him, Daddy King, continue to operate in that role as the prophetic voice of the city, holding institutions accountable, but also a kind of hospitality toward others, including their white Christian counterparts.
Right.
And young Dr. King himself was never senior pastor of Ebenezer, but he was the assistant pastor to his own father during the height of the civil rights movement. So when the church looked for someone who could step in and understand those dual roles of forming good people, virtuous people, speaking to the issues of piety and living a good life, a good family, and on the other hand, speaking truth to power, they did select an extraordinary young leader in Raphael Warnock.
Within that context, help us understand now the role that the Loeffler campaign, that Republican campaigns have put Raphael Warnock in, that he is being portrayed as a radical, as a socialist. His sermons, there are clips of them in these ads suggesting that he is too far out of the mainstream. And it seems that it's not very subtle, but their job is to scare those white suburban voters away and to make what you pointed out was this rock of sort of moral authority, the Ebenezer Church, something to be scared of. How is that playing?
That's not playing very well at all in African American communities, but even in moderate suburban white communities. Many of my students are pastors in those communities, so I do have some pulse read on what they hear, and they find it deeply offensive. The problem is that Raphael Warnock has a long track record in the city of Atlanta as a moderating voice, as a convening voice, a reconciling voice, as well as a voice of social justice. He's a reconciler, and so to have this rather one-dimensional, harsh mischaracterization of Raphael Warnock's quite balanced ministry is, I think, not serving Senator Loeffler well. I'm disappointed in her. I had high hopes.
We have to take a quick break. More of my conversation with Dr. Franklin and Jim Galloway in just a moment. Stick with us.